Well, I wanted to welcome everyone to another Fireside Adoptee Fire Series interview. And we are very honored today to have Elizabeth Sotiropoulos with us. And let me just tell you a little bit about Elizabeth. There's much to tell, but Elizabeth was adopted from foster care. She's passionate about advancing children's rights, especially for displaced children. They work with middle and high school students along with young professionals. Elizabeth has also served as an elected school board member and wrote policy at the local and state levels to increase funding for public education and improve academic outcomes for students. Now, Elizabeth's excited to share how her experience coming out of the adoption fog, which is a favorite topic of mine, helped her become her fullest, most authentic, most mentally healthy self. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, great. Yeah. There was no question in my mind that I wanted to approach you about this for a long time. And maybe you haven't known, because I'm not a presence on TikTok. I'm just a name and with no content. But I admire so much the work that's being done there. And I'd like to devote a special part of the interview just to talking about some of the dynamics there and the intricacies of being a social media, in effect, a type of warrior or somebody who has to be really girded up for doing this type of work. But wanted to ask you some of the basic things about your adoption story. So I know, as I read in the bio statement here, you were adopted from foster care. Would you like to talk a little bit about your early years and your adoption, the experience of that?
Sure. So I was born in August of 1988. I was raised by my biological parents, both of them, for the first 4 months of my life. We lived in transitional housing for unhoused people. And then for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me and may not ever be clear, one day my biological parents started driving south from the state where I was born, and they stopped in the state of Illinois, and they relinquished me for adoption when I was 4 months old. And so I became a ward of the state in Illinois, and I was adopted. Well, of course, the people who became my adoptive parents took custody of me, and I was adopted about 9 months later. I was told that I was adopted when I was 3 years old, when I asked my adoptive mom, who at the time was just mom to me. I asked her where babies came from, and she told me what a lot of parents tell their kids when they ask that question. And I said, okay, did I come out of your tummy? And she said, well, no, you came from another woman's tummy, but she wasn't able to raise you. And so she gave us this gift. She gave us you because we weren't able to have children of our own. It was a very selfless thing that she did. And that's the story that I got. And from that moment, I was very confused about who I was and what it meant to be adopted. And I believe I've spent the rest of my life since trying to get answers to those questions.
I can imagine the confusion. Now, it's great that they told you.
Yes.
And I know that and obviously I'm an advocate of people telling children from a young age. And of course, we know that there's what I call it a drawback, but the fact that your mind can't process it also when you're a certain young age. Were there any other children in the family, any other adoptees or any natural siblings? I'm sorry, you just said that they were not able to have children, but did they adopt any other kids?
No, I was raised as an only child. I do have 7 biological siblings, but I was raised as an only child.
And since they began that discussion with you early on, were you able to continue talking with them about adoption as you got older, or was that something you kind of worked through on your own as you thought about it?
Yeah, I would say both. I would ask my adoptive parents every chance I could about my biological parents, but I could tell it really upset them. And I really want to give my adoptive mom credit, because there were times that, looking back now as an adult, as a mother myself, I can see where my adoptive mom really tried to do the right thing sometimes. And one time that stands out to me is I remember being 6 years old, and I was just sitting in my room, minding my own business, playing whatever I was playing. And she came in and she said, I want to show you something. And she had a photograph of me with my biological parents. And she said, these are your biological parents. These are your birth parents. And I remember holding that picture in my hand for the first time. and it was very surreal. But whenever I tried to ask more questions, I could tell my adoptive mom would get nervous about answering them. So a lot of my searching for these answers, I did in secret. My adoptive parents told me that I could not search for my biological parents or have any kind of connection with them until after I became an adult. But that didn't stop me. From the time I was about 6, maybe a tiny bit older, I would go through my adoptive parents, like they had some papers about my adoption in one of their drawers. And so anytime like they weren't really paying attention, I would go through these papers and try to find answers about myself. So, and of course I would keep that to myself. I would never share because I didn't want to upset them. As soon as my parents got a computer and internet, one of the very first things I searched for were my biological parents. At the time, Google wasn't quite what it is now, but I used Yahooligans. So I used Yahooligans and I put in my biological parents' names just to see what I could find about them. And when I learned about the concept of genealogy and creating your family tree, I tried to do that as well when I was still just a kid and a young teen. So a lot of my search I tried to do on my own. It felt very secretive to me. But of course, as I got older and I became an adult, that search became more public.
Yeah, I would imagine so. You were growing into being able to express yourself that way. And once, obviously, they would know eventually that you were doing this. When they found out, was there a lot of pushback from them or a display of being upset with you, like you talked about? Or was there any acceptance of it?
So when I was 18, I made a post on an adoption website. I don't think the website exists anymore, but I just said my name, my birth name, the names of my birth parents, any information that I had about them. It was just a short post. I said, if you're one of these people or if you know them, I really want to be in contact with them. Here's my email address. Please contact me. It's only good feelings, only feelings of gratitude. I was still in the fog at that time. And so from that post, my biological father found me about a year later. I was 19. And when I read his email, it was so powerful. And I just felt like a light turn on inside of me. An answer is here. And I excitedly told my adoptive mom about half an hour later. And I didn't expect her reaction. She just burst into tears and she was so upset. And I said, like, oh, what's wrong? Like, I thought you wanted this. And she said, I just feel so threatened. And you better not tell your dad, my adoptive dad. In retrospect, I don't know that he would have been that upset, but that was her reaction. And from that reaction really set the tone for me to not share anything with my adoptive mom going forward, to keep being really secretive about my biological parents, even though I really didn't want to be secretive. But I just felt so ashamed from that moment forward.
Yeah, so there's that blanket of obligation that can be in there, right?
Absolutely.
And I know some people who said they had decided they wouldn't search because it would hurt their parents. Now, I searched. I got a similar response, which was the first words out of my mom's mouth were, "We don't know what we could have done to have failed you like this." So, and there were the tears, and I thought my parents were having heart attacks the way they responded. So I told them both at the same time. And it was my birth mother's request that I do that in order to stay in reunion with her. So I kind of was stuck. But when you mentioned it setting the tone, I can relate to that as well. As it certainly did for me. And it actually led to a rupture of the relationship for a long time. And even that I picked up my family and moved to the East Coast, partly to get away from it. So I can understand what that must have felt like for you. And you were still pretty young, right? At that point when all of this came out and you wanted to share the excitement of what you're discovering, and then you're met with this. Unfortunately, it seems like so many adoptees are in that situation where they're just not free to express the real things they want to talk about. And it sounds like also you weren't really free to talk about being an adoptee within the context of your family. How about at school or anywhere else? Were you talking to anyone who was adopted or talking about it anywhere?
Yeah. So before I answer your question, I just want to say this word that popped to my mind was compartmentalize. I learned from a fairly young age to compartmentalize myself, and I started to have multiple identities. And coming out of that multiple identity state of existence is still a very new thing for me. For me to just show up in all of these different spaces and places being just myself is something I'm still getting used to. And it is very much tied to how my adoptive parents reacted to, or my adoptive mom especially, reacting to how my biological father found me. But yes, okay. So my connection with other adoptees. When I was 8, there was a family in my neighborhood who was a foster family. And that was the first time that I ever met other children who were adopted. But their story was just so different from mine. And then, of course, the other stories that I heard about adoption were like the Hallmark movies, the Lifetime movies,
Yeah.
that really whitewashed, sanitized version of adoption. So I thought something was always really strange about my adoption, and I didn't really talk about it. I didn't really know how. But what I started to do, and maybe I never started to do this, maybe I just always did it, was I reveled in the mystery of it all. I didn't have answers about myself, so I was just kind of mysterious, I guess. Everything seemed possible. I could be anything. My ancestors could have been anybody. My ethnicity, my background could be anything. So I guess how I interacted less with other adoptees and more with the idea of being adopted was just making up all of these stories. Like, I could be this, I could be this, I could be that. And I think I was afraid to meet other adoptees for a long time, because then I would have to actually figure out who I really am. I can't just be anybody. I have to be one person.
Interesting. So it would lead to a coherence or a funneling of your story into one channel, and the compartments would be harder to maintain. And the fantasy part of it, right? The parts of it that were probably freeing in a way, that I could be all these things, but to find out that once it resolves into something definite, then a lot of that gets shattered, right? For what you were experiencing and thinking in terms of your interpretation of yourself.
Yeah. Once you have answers, you have answers. If you have answers and you're telling a different story, or you're saying something else could be possible, in my mind, now that's definitely lying.
Hmm. So, but it sounds like you did have some familiarity with adoptees growing up, or maybe you knew some. Am I correct in that? Or
Yeah,
did you have any
mostly
conversation?
from this family, this foster family that lived in my neighborhood.
Okay. Yeah. And I found it growing up with a couple adoptees that I never talked to them about it. Did you talk to anyone about it, or did you just know what they were as foster kids, that a different type of status for them, and just kind of be aware of it but never discuss it?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty close to what I experienced, especially as a kid. The first time I really talked with another adoptee and formed a relationship, a friendship with them, was another adoptee who was very close to my age. We went to college together, and it was so interesting. We had the same first and middle names. We had so many things in common, but we were both very religious. And so we both thought about our adoptions as actually being this savioristic thing. Like, we were saved and this was God's plan, and we should just be really happy and grateful to not still be part of this terrible place that we came from. And so that felt like a concrete story that I could really latch on to, and somebody else validated it for me. So I tried to line up with that story because it seemed to work so well for her. Um, until it didn't feel right for me anymore. And I think after that experience, we really stopped being friends. I felt pushed back into into the fog, I guess. I felt pushed back into
Yeah.
not knowing and not really wanting to engage with other adoptees because it just felt so wrong to talk about.
I think that's exactly where I was going to go next, which is the fog. Okay. What does it mean to you? I know that not everybody relates to it. I understand it. I certainly do, because it was a very real place for me and for so many adoptees I know. And it was a cushion for me where everything looked a certain way, and that was my reality. And then to come out of it was devastating in a lot of ways and upheaval for me. What was the fog to you, and what did it feel like to exit the fog?
Yeah. So this is TikTok.
Okay, good. Here we go.
I had downloaded the TikTok app sometime last year because one of my best friends, who's also adopted, but at the time we weren't really talking about our adoption status much. She had been sending me some videos on TikTok. I'm like, TikTok is stupid, whatever. I'll watch a few videos here and there. Well, I started to be on the app more and more. And because the FYP knows us better than we know ourselves, these adoptee videos started showing up. And at first I was like, oh no, nope. Don't want to deal with that. Don't want to hear that. Don't want to, no. But then I started to develop the courage to listen to these videos, these adoptee talk videos, a little bit. And I started to hear other adoptees saying the same things that I had very secretly, very privately been dealing with. I don't fit in. I don't belong anywhere. I am weird. Nobody understands me. Anytime I try to explain what's wrong with me, people talk over me and they tell me that I am wrong. I am misunderstanding. And hearing other adoptees share their experience showed me that, wait, okay, everything I've been experiencing, it is real. And I'm not the only one who's experienced these things.
Yeah.
From there, I picked up The Primal Wound. And that was a very, very difficult book for me to read. I read like a page at a time and I would just sob heavily because it was speaking to this part of me that my whole life, this first 4 months of my life, felt like this dark, scary thing that was in a box that I didn't want to touch. Because again, going back to the whole truth thing, if I know what actually happened, I can't pretend anymore. I can't take comfort in my fantasies. So coming out of the fog was me very, very slowly acknowledging, yeah, this happened to me. I had to get over this truth that, so I used to think that if I acknowledged that I had survived trauma as an infant, and if every adoption truly does begin with trauma, that meant I experienced trauma. And I used to think that meant people who've experienced trauma, they are broken. So if I've experienced trauma, I am broken. Something's wrong with me. But coming out of the fog really changed my perspective. I realized, oh, no, actually, that's just something that was done to me. And everybody experiences trauma. The trauma that I experienced as an infant really like built the foundation for what happened next, but it also doesn't define me. So coming out of the fog was wrestling with, there is not like a really clear, clean, neat answer. It's complex. It also meant, again, I'm like listening to more and more adoptee talk videos, listening to more people share their experiences. It meant acknowledging that my adoptive mom's feelings, the ones that I worked so hard to protect and change and make her feel better, they actually were never mine. they were never my responsibility in the first place. And so there was this period that I went into where I had to not isolate myself, but separate myself from everybody and everything that had ever reinforced this adoption fog, and figure out for myself who I am and what do I want? What do I owe to myself, not to others? What is my own story, not how do I complete somebody else's story? How do I get rid of this guilt that I feel when I choose myself instead of trying to be chosen by other people? It's been a journey. It's been an evolving journey. But yeah, that's just a little bit about what it's been like for me.
I think the way you're speaking right now is why so many of us admire you on TikTok, because this is the clarity and the sharpness and the thoughtfulness and the eloquence that you were meteoric in the sense you rose up really fast on TikTok and people were just flocking to you. And I don't mean meteoric in the sense that people tend to fall from a great height. You've stayed as somebody who's been very, very prominent and visible and influential in a really great way for, I'm speaking for a lot of people, obviously, who time and time again, when we come to see what you've created, the way you're able to express it so clearly and so powerfully, and you're addressing people who are challenging you. And that, I hope when we talk a little bit more about the TikTok piece, is something I know I wouldn't be equipped to do that, for example. It takes a special kind of resourcefulness, I think, on a personal level, for someone to be able to engage like that with people who are challenging you all the time or who just want to give you a hard time. But the way you've spoken here, I feel like, and I'm probably not alone here, that people would stand up and clap, because you said all these things. And you're also expressing the vulnerability that I kind of came out of the fog when I joined this app, you're saying. And I remember when I first saw you in Fireside, and I was really excited. And I remember messaging you, and you said, I'm more scared here than I am on TikTok. I don't know if you remember saying that, but
I do.
I thought that was interesting, but it makes a lot of sense too, I think, right? Because there's a reality, there's a realness to being in a community with people who understand you that removes a lot of the superficiality you might feel like, even though you weren't ever portraying that, but you just like, I don't have as many places to go and hide when I'm in with real people that understand my experience like this.
I'm definitely not used to feeling understood. And if I could, dog just walked in, kind of distracting me, but I know you're adopted too, and you want to be part of the conversation. I wanted to speak a little bit to where I think some of that comes from. When I was a kid, so there's like at least two pieces to this. My adoptive father was hard of hearing, very hard of hearing. And I, as a child, was constantly interpreting between him and other people. So whether that was my teachers at school, my friends' parents, anybody, I was always interpreting into language he understood at a volume he could understand. That paired with, when I was a kid, I was always really deep, always asking lots of questions that would take all of the adults, parents, teachers, whoever, like, where did that question come from? And I would think, well, don't you want to know? Like, aren't you curious about everything that's around you? And so as a kid, I really did want to be understood, but I also just wanted my questions answered. And so I think I got very used to this idea that if I could just explain myself perfectly, one day my adoptive parents were going to snap out of it. They were going to wake up. They were going to see exactly what I see. They would understand why I'm asking all of these questions. And for a long time, until maybe like last year, I genuinely thought the problem was me. I would keep trying to find ways to explain things more clearly, more like simply, and I just never got it. And maybe it was about this time last year that I realized if somebody is determined to not understand me or any of us, it doesn't matter how we try to explain ourselves. We could be perfectly clear. If they don't want to understand, they won't.
Yeah. And the search or the inner drive for that clarity. I want to point out also that the dispositional difference from your family and the way it played out, because it happened in my family too, which is, where does he get all the questions? And they weren't bad to me, but it just highlighted the difference between how I was with their natural children. And they must have been astonished to hear you and this prodigious language coming out of you. And don't you want to know what the world is like and what things are? And they're probably like, I don't even know if I have concepts to think that with you. So
Yeah,
it can lead to a lonely feeling too, right? When you're
absolutely.
yeah. I felt that way too, is I felt like they would just kind of laugh and say, oh, you're just too smart, I guess. And they wouldn't engage me.
Yeah. Yeah. I was shamed a lot for like really trying to understand anything, whether it was about adoption or science or God or whatever. And I would just keep asking questions or make some kind of point, which in retrospect were phenomenal points. But sometimes my adoptive mom would say, oh, you think you're so smart. Like, well, actually, I don't. That's why I'm asking the question. But for a long time, it was hard for me to believe that it was actually a good thing to ask questions. I didn't really trust myself in that until probably college.
Hmm. Do you find that once you learned about the trauma, there was a thing, once you could accept that, and it didn't mean a broken person, did you see though that there were responses in your life to the trauma that you finally were able to identify? A lot of it's like, I suddenly was like, well, that's why I always did that. Did you have anything comparable like that in your life that you would feel comfortable talking about?
Um, yeah, there are a lot. Um, for me, it has been a little challenging to figure out, is some response that I have, is that about being adopted, or is that about the family that I was raised in, or is it both? So some things that have always stood out, or is it just who I am? And I would have been this way even if I had been raised by my biological family. So some things that I have experienced are this incredibly like fierce passion for justice. It has to be fair. Everything has to be fair and it has to make sense. And I get very angry if something doesn't feel fair to me. And that's been a response that I've had to learn how to train, because I don't want to be a Karen, right? And I know that given my identity as a white woman, I could definitely be a Karen. So I've had to learn how to apply my passion for justice in productive ways that don't harm other people. I have always, definitely when I was a kid, I've always had gigantic emotions.
Mhm.
I would go from 0 to 100 in my rage really fast as a kid. And sometimes that's tied to justice. This isn't fair. Why is this happening to me? Or why is it happening to somebody else?
Yeah.
So I used to think there was something wrong with my emotions and with feeling anger. And now I've started to learn that anger is actually the emotion that loves me the most. When I feel angry about something, it's because whether it's my mind or my body remembering that something happened to me that's causing this protective response. Um, I've had to I've had to learn how to navigate that. Um, I have a tendency to be on my own. Like, I know a lot of people, maybe this is more about kept people than adopted people, but a lot of people really don't feel comfortable being by themselves, like taking themselves out for a date, or
Yeah.
going on a long drive by themselves, or just being on their own. For me, that has always felt so natural and safe and comfortable for me. I've had to learn how to feel more comfortable being with other people and having relationships. And again, I don't know if that's from being adopted, from the family I was raised in, both. Maybe that's also just partly me. But these are all things that seem to be very common for adoptees. So I have a feeling it is a trauma response.
Very interesting. Yeah. I know for myself, it showed up in how I was raising my kids, it showed up in my relationships. And I didn't know it. I was always identified as being depressed and go work on yourself, go do this, go try to fix that. And nothing ever seemed to work. And then I realized when I came out of the fog, well, nobody was talking about what was really going on. So I never got better from that perspective. And
Yeah.
by then, so many things had been established in my life as patterns that people almost didn't want to give me a chance to say, I know what's going on now. Can we address this? It was almost like, well, it's kind of late for that now, which is tragic for me. And I unfortunately heard a lot of adoptees gone through similar experiences as that. But there's a liberating part of coming out of the fog, and there's a terrifying part, I think. But I feel like it's really fascinating to know that you were experiencing this in live, literally live too, also, but dialogues with people on the platform, on the TikTok platform, and seeing and being validated by all these experiences coming. That wasn't me. That wasn't just me. And it turned out to be, no, I wasn't wrong in this. And finally, I can see all these people who understand me that way. And it's, for me, that's been the greatest part of finding the community, even though, of course, like I said, I'm not really on TikTok, but just being here doing something like this, for example. And I could listen to you all day. That's not meant to be false flattery. It's just so, it resonates so strongly. And I feel like, as I'm looking at the chat here, people are bouncing around and going, yes, 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 yes. I think that's why we admire so much what you're doing on that platform. I wanted to ask you some things about that specifically, if we could talk about that, which is,
Sure.
Was it scary to suddenly come out and start talking about this? And were you surprised by the responses you got?
Oh, that's a good question. So, because I'm recalling my very first TikTok. I remember exactly what I was wearing, how I had my makeup, and one of the very first things I said in that video was, I have waited for so long to tell my story.
Hmm.
And so in some ways, maybe it was a little bit scary, but I think I just felt, no, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is where I can tell my story. But I think what's really important in sharing that is, I was on school board for, at that point, 3 years before I joined TikTok. So I was elected to my local school board in 2019, and I definitely had a reputation for being very outspoken about children's rights. And I really was not concerned with adult feelings. I was not concerned with adults who would say, who would counter me whenever I would say something like, this system in our schools is racist. It's hurting Black children the most. The way that we are treating children in this part of our school district is unacceptable. So I was very used to making bold statements and getting pushback, because when I know that something is right, when I know that I have a message that's in alignment with justice, I don't really mind people pushing back. Does it hurt sometimes? Absolutely. But I still want to say my thing anyway. But yeah, when I made my first videos, and I think when I started getting maybe my first 20 followers, I felt so validated. Like, wow, there is one other person out there, just one. That would be enough for me. One other person that hears my story and validates it. That meant a lot to me. What sometimes is challenging is when I will share something very real, very vulnerable, and somebody will come along and leave a comment that's like, that's not real, that didn't happen. I'm like, tell me more about my own childhood, huh? Tell me more about my own adopted parents, huh? Like, internet stranger. But I'm learning how to not take that so personally and realize that I'm a stranger to them as much as they're a stranger to me. And their comments are truly a reflection of themselves and their unhealed state they're not really about me because they just don't know me.
Wow, that's actually really, I think, a very healthy way to think about that, right? That it allows you, and you're really good at this, which is you speak to, I'll see the picture up on the screen of who you're addressing, and you're talking to them, but you're not enraged. You're passionate, but you're not at a, in an emotional state where maybe that would be the thing that stood out to them was, oh, I can't listen to this person because they're coming at me. You're like, let me tell you the facts about this. Let's talk about this. I want you to understand. You really want somebody to understand why you have these positions and why the experience of adoptees, adult adoptees in particular, gets snubbed and hushed and sent in the back seat and silenced, been censured. And I think it's interesting that people seem not to believe that. Well, I know someone who's adopted and they're fine, right? I know you've seen every response, I think, under the sun, and had
Yes.
a chance to interact with everything.
Sometimes there's somebody who will say something that I'm like, wow, that's okay. You typed that and you pressed enter. Okay. But yeah, and I want to be fair. Last fall when I really started, there were videos that I made. There were responses that I made that did come from a place of being enraged.
Sure.
And the people that caught that deserved it. I think it's important to see adoptee anger, adoptee rage. But when I was in a place of I had calmed down and I was more emotionally even, and I would go back and I would watch those videos, I didn't like them because that's sometimes those videos where I would really go after people, they would go viral. And people really seem to like that. And I realized for myself, okay, that is a way, that is an option. But for me, myself, my message is getting lost. The thing that I really wanted to say got lost. And now people are just, enjoying the rage, enjoying the show. And that's not the point. I don't want you to enjoy the show. I want you to hear what I'm saying, and I want you to change what you're doing as a response.
Yeah, and it's true that there's a valid expression of the rage because the injustice is great, and of
Yes.
course among marginalized people and particularly among transracial adoptees. And I want to talk to you a little bit about intersectionality in a minute too, if we could. But there's a legitimate place for that, and yet there's the need for the message to be heard.
Yeah.
And people are all too eager to see the enraged part and go, that's the part that's going to go big. That's the part everybody's going to want to see, and that's the one that's going to enforce the way everybody thinks. Look at these adoptees; they're out of their minds. Look at the thing. Then you get more of the trolls and more of the people weighing in, like you're all unhinged, and you hear all these terrible things and see all that stuff, and it perpetuates. So the fact that you were able to pull back from that and practice the self-reflection of, is that really conducive to what I'm trying to get across, is really exemplary, I think, and leads to the effectiveness of what you're doing. So I wanted to say that's really appreciated. And I think among people watching that I've talked to a lot of people about you and said, look at what Elizabeth did. Look at this, how good this is. And I think it's funny because I'll watch one, I'll go, that's the best thing I've ever heard, and I'll save it. Then I'll hear the next one, I'll go, that's the best thing I've ever heard now, and I'll save that. And they just build up, which is great because you're giving the voice to so many things that so many of us have felt and wish that we had the powers of articulation to be able to say that way. So it's great that you were primed also for interacting with people who would be pushing back on you. Like you said, the work you did with schools, et cetera, promoted that sort of understanding. Like you were ready for engagement like that. And maybe other people would be like, I didn't expect that to happen to me, so I'll withdraw or I'll recede from the scene and not be heard in the same way. But you've been able to stay passionate about that and keep the message coming through. I did want to ask you about intersectionality because I know that that's been a big part of your story too. Would you like to speak a little bit about that, about how these elements of your life are playing out, and whether adoption, how that would factor into there as well?
So yeah, that's a very good question. So for me, intersectionality in any kind of activist work, any kind of justice work, is acknowledging that there are many different identities and many different experiences that we can all share, especially if we're adoptees. So some places where I have learned some lessons, I had been really passionate about racial justice even before joining TikTok and starting to talk about adoption. But I did learn some lessons where I had some biases still. I was like, wow, really? Even after all this time, I still carry these biases with me. So that's been a humbling experience. And it's reminded me, yes, learning to deconstruct all the ways that I learned how to exist as a white person in the United States. That's going to be a lifelong journey for me. And I always need to defer on, especially issues of racism. I need to defer to adoptees who have actually experienced those issues firsthand.
Yeah.
I try to be very careful, and I don't always know exactly how to do it perfectly, but I try to both use the fact that I am white and that just the reality we live in means that my voice is going to be heard. I try to use my voice to elevate other voices that, through no fault of their own, just aren't heard like mine. So that hopefully, not only because of me, but if all of us are trying to do that, we can create a future, we can create a society where that won't be anymore. I really believe in that. Another way that I experience or I deal with intersectionality in adoption justice work is in being queer. So something that was really hard for me when I started talking about adoption on TikTok was there are a lot of queer couples, gay and lesbian couples especially, that use adoption to build their families. And that was tricky for me because I identify as a queer person, but I am very against that. I'm very against people using adoption simply to build their families, not with the aim of improving life for a child in crisis. So learning how to communicate those messages when that those words don't yet exist or that message hasn't yet been crafted, that's been challenging because I don't want to be seen as homophobic. But I guess sometimes that's something you have to navigate as you're creating these new spaces and this new messaging for people in these tight spaces.
That was really insightful, and I really appreciate that. And I know it comes from someone who has the experience of the social justice piece and also from your own experience. So I really appreciate you sharing a little about that. I wanted to close by asking if you could tell people one thing. Let's say your audience is all right here. Is there a certain succinct thing you would want for people to know about adoptees?
Oh, succinct. Ooh.
10,000 words or less, or more. Maybe impossible is a question.
Here's maybe the message I would say is top of mind for me today. For adoptees, we have been conditioned for a very long time to believe that we are very different from everyone else. We are special, we are a gift, and we were put on this planet specifically to make other people happy. And this message began from such a young age for us. And peeling back that message and realizing that actually we were just born and we really are like everyone else. What happened to us is pretty different from what happens to about 98% of people who live in the United States. But still, we deserve to be happy. We deserve to live our own lives. We deserve to have our own liberation. We deserve to be free. And we deserve truth. And we deserve to be able to tell our story the way we want to. And even though that journey is very complicated, there aren't a whole lot of, guidebooks on how to figure that out just yet. I think we all play a really important role in writing those guidebooks or making those guide videos, and being there for each other and figuring all of this out as we create the lives that we deserve to have. So wherever, to all adoptees, wherever you are on this journey, whether you're, dipping your toe into the defog water, or you're, farther along than I am, your story is really important. And if it's a story that you want to share, or any part of it that you want to share, if that makes you feel more whole and more valid, you should.
Wow, great words. Thank you so much. Where can people follow you?
So my most public place is on TikTok. I'm Adoptee Queen of Wands. And then for people that I have a little bit more of a personal connection with, I'm also on Facebook and Instagram as my name, Elizabeth Sotiropoulos.
Well, this has been a real honor for me. And I think based on what I'm seeing in the chat, people are really excited that you've been here. So I want to thank you personally for making time for us today. And we're really grateful, not grateful adoptees, but let's use the word appreciative. I usually prefer that one. So we're appreciative that you've been here. And thank you so much for your time today, Elizabeth. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for letting me take up space.
Thank you. So this will conclude, you'll hear in just a moment, everyone, that will conclude the recording section of Zoom here. So you'll hear an announcement that the recording has ended. And after that, we'll go to questions and answers for a few minutes here. And again, this was, along with other interviews, will be up on the Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel within the next couple of days. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording and we will go into Q&A.